afternoon, members of council. Kathleen Krager, Senior Traffic Engineer with Comprehensive Planning. And I'm here today to discuss PPRTA 2, which hopefully is an extension of our current PPRTA 1. Thank you. PPRTA, as you all know, we have a 1-cent sales tax in this community that goes to the Pikes Peak Rural Transportation Authority. It was passed in 2004, and it's broken down in that 35% of that 1 cent goes to a maintenance fund, 10% goes to transit. Those two things are ongoing and will continue until there's a vote of our voters that take it away, basically. And 55% is used on capital projects, and that 55% is scheduled to sunset in December of 2014. So city staff this last year has started looking at, with the advice of PPRTA board, the potential of going back to the voters and asking for an extension of the capital projects. Why do we need to continue with this 55% of 1 cent for capital projects? Well, if you look at where we get our capital money, it becomes really obvious why it's so important. PPRTA is providing the city approximately, and this is just the city, not the region, approximately $27 million a year in capital projects. Our federal funds that we get from PPACG are projected next year to give us $4 million in capital projects. There's a real disconnect. We used to get more money from the federal government for those capital projects, and it has been steadily declining since 2000 and will continue to decline, unfortunately. So that makes our PPRTA money all that more important for us to do the local projects that we're no longer getting federal or state funds to do. Back in 2004, when we started PPRTA 1, the real emphasis in the city was doing capacity projects. We had a major congestion problem in this city that everyone was concerned about. Well, if you notice these days, we're not having as big a congestion problem. Part of that is because we've taken care of it with PPRTA funds. Part of it is a result of the recession, where we actually are driving less than we were before the recession. And part of it is that our emphasis has changed, as it has across the United States. Turn to any magazine these days, any news magazines, and you'll probably find an article about crumbling infrastructure. And the city of Colorado Springs is no different than the rest of the United States. We definitely have a crumbling infrastructure problem. And this is really the result that we had rapid growth in our infrastructure, basically after World War II, although really since the Depression, since 1930, and it has not been replaced yet, and infrastructure only lasts so long. Even when you try to keep it in good repair, which we do with our maintenance funds from PPRTA, you can only repair a bridge structure or pavement structure for so many years before you really need to go in and do a major project there. And that's where we're finding ourselves. So when city staff first started talking about PPRTA 2, we looked at identifying the types of projects that we need this capital money for. And we broke it down into 5 projects, and our most important category was restoration and preservation. This is not really maintenance money. Maintenance money are things that we do year after year to keep our system going. It is the roadway overlays, the filling in of potholes, the minor maintenance of bridges. But even if we keep doing those, we reach a point where we have to do a major reconstruction on a bridge, or we have to tear pavement out down to the base and start over again to really make it decent. And those are the types of preservation, restoration projects we're looking at, and those are really capital projects. The other 4 categories, we found 2 that were fairly big: modernization and safety, expansion and enhancement. That expansion and enhancement used to be our real big one. That would be our capacity projects. And then we added 2 smaller categories: non-motorized and transit. Restoration and preservation, that's that take care of what you've got category. So we're really looking at bridges, pavement, and signals. That's our basic infrastructure in the city, and they all three wear out, and we need to replace them over time. Modernization and safety, these are our safety improvements, such as improving sight distance, upgrading a signal for a safer operation, adding guardrail, maybe improving a whole section of road to reduce the number of accidents on it. Expansion and enhancement, this is our increase in capacity section. In 2004, we did a lot of increasing of capacity at a single point, such as Austin, Blessed Union, or Woodman at Academy. At the moment, we don't have so many of those single point areas that we need to improve capacity as we have missing links in our system. So we were really looking for those missing links or sections of roadway that need to be upgraded that didn't get upgraded previously. Non-motorized projects, I know what you're thinking, we have a TOPS for this. And TOPS does take care of a major portion of our trail system. But we still have on-street bike lanes, sidewalks that need work. And on the existing trail system, TOPS does not handle the reconstruction that's needed every once in a while. Those trails have a tendency to fail just as our bridges and roadways fail, and we need to go in and work on our trail system on a regular basis as well. And then we added a transit section. The 10% of the 1 cent that goes to transit really helps with the operational costs of transit. You cannot get any operational money out of FTA or the federal government to run a transit system. We depend completely on local money to run the operations. But in addition to running the operations, FTA also expects us to come up with 20% local match for all of the FTA grants. What transit has been discovering is that they struggle between coming up with the 20% local match and coming up with the operating money. And if they do the local match, they're dipping into the operating funds. If they do the operating funds, they're dipping into the local match, and they're constantly fighting with each other. So we looked at providing some capital money that could be used as that 20% local match for FTA grants to really help the transit system out. There are a number of advantages that staff felt in doing this technique of looking at these categories of projects rather than just looking at all projects as the same. We can develop different criteria for each category so that we are judging one trail against another trail, one bad bridge against another bad bridge, and one safety project against another safety project, rather than trying to compare all three under the same criteria and figure out which one's most important. We can also set specific funding amounts, which is what we did, saying we think the majority of funding should go to restoration and preservation, and that a small amount of funding should go to non-motorized and transit. And it assures a fair analysis of similar projects. So we aren't throwing a project out just because it was graded next to a lot of other projects that were a completely different use. This whole effort has already gone through CTAB and has been recommended by CTAB to Council. It's coming to Council for official action on the 28th of February, and then it will go on to PPRTA, where it will go to the CAC and then the board. Ultimately, at the board, they will be looking at the list of projects to put on the ballot. They'll also be looking at a 10-year versus 12-year funding period. Previously, we've looked at a 10-year funding period. The reason why 12 years has come up is that this year, this happens to fall in a presidential election, that we're looking at an extension of PPRTA. That's actually pretty nice because we get a broad cross-section of voters and a lot of voters coming to vote. So we have a lot of voters voting on PPRTA, and that's a good thing that we ask as many of our people as possible their opinion. The board thought that that would be a good thing to do in the future as well, and that's why they suggested we look at a 12-year funding period. CTAB has also recommended a 12-year funding period. However, staff is recommending a 10-year funding period. The reason for this is that it previously was a 10-year period. We think the voters are comfortable with a 10-year sunset. And to be truthful, we will have presidential elections in the future that we can take the next round of PPRTA 2 or PPRTA 3 in a presidential election if that becomes important. But most important, I think that 10 years is something our voters are comfortable with. The truth of the matter is, even before the 10 and 12 years, there were those that were suggesting maybe a 20-year funding period is appropriate. We're having to come up with a list of projects, and sometimes our crystal ball isn't all that great, even for 10 years. There's a fear among staff that it might be coming foggy for 12 years. So we're most comfortable with the 10-year. The board will also be looking at how we determine an A list and a B list. We will not be recommending a C list this time around. PPRTA 1 was split that they estimated the revenue for PPRTA 1, and that revenue estimate turned out to be a little wrong because nobody knew that a major recession was going to be coming. But they estimated the revenue, and then they assigned 90% of that revenue is what the A list would be. The B list would take us to 100% of the revenue, and the C list would take us to 110%. It turns out that we got done with the A list because we got some federal funding, and we'll get into the B list a little bit. Most of that guess was because of two things. One is that we did have a major recession, and it did upset the revenue projections. And two, when you're estimating cost estimates for 10 years out, sometimes you're not as accurate on those cost estimates as you would hope to be. And so we've had projects that have cost more than the original estimate was. And so we didn't get as far into the process as possible. This time, the board has asked that we assume the revenues for PPRTA 2 will be the exact same as they have been for PPRTA 1. So in other words, we're automatically assuming that there's another major recession coming into PPRTA 2 timeframe. So hopefully we're very conservative with our revenue estimates. We're looking at two scenarios. One is an A list that does 75% of those estimated revenues, and a B list that goes 150%. That is the recommendation of both CTAB and city staff. The reason for that recommendation is we want to make sure we have an A list that we get through. We want to be able to promise our voters, yes, I promise you I will get through that A list and really mean it. And it also means that when we get through the A list, we can jump to the B list, and now we have a whole fresh assortment of projects that we can begin to look at and decide which one needs to go forward. By going to 150% on the B list, we're assuring ourselves that if the revenue estimates were low and we have a lot more revenue than we thought, we will have plenty of projects on the list to do. And it also gives us a wide variety of projects on the B list that we can jump to when we get through with the A list. The other split that the board has asked us to look at, and we do have the numbers for that, are an 85% and a 115%. There's likely to be some changes to the ballot language. However, that has not been discussed yet, and we'll be coming back to you at a later date to discuss those ballot language changes. The general feeling is we want to keep the ballot language as close to the original ballot as possible and as simple as possible, while maybe correcting any of the hiccups that we've seen in PPRTA 1 and actually doing the projects. What you have before you and had in your package is the full PPRTA 2 project list, both as a 10-year list and as a 12-year list, with a 75% and a 150% cut. What you're going to notice is a couple things that are different. First of all, the lists look much longer. With PPRTA 1, we had 29 projects on the A list. With the list that you have now at just 75% of revenue, we have 54 projects and a lot more projects on the B list. The reason there's so many more projects is that we're looking at projects that overall have a smaller amount of money. That was a happy circumstance in looking at so many preservation restoration projects, but we also tried to look at projects that had a smaller cost so that we could do more, because then they would become spread out across the city, and they do really have a nice variation of projects all the way across the city. Just to give you a couple highlights of the projects as you look down your list. Preservation and restoration, we have an emergency fund for bridges, because we've learned that even when we pay attention to our bridges, occasionally a big hole falls in the deck that we didn't think was going to happen, and we suddenly have to have money to repair a deck or something else on a bridge. This would provide us about $5 million over the 10-year period to make sure that we always have some emergency money if something goes wrong with one of the bridges. We have 6 bridges on the A list, plus a study to examine what bridges we should be doing on Shook's Run. And on the B list, there's another 22 bridges. There's also 6 miles of reconstruction of pavement that's completely tearing out the pavement and redoing it on the A list. And completion of, I believe it's about 45 signals that need to be reconstructed. Most of those would be span wire signals that have become quite old. In modernization and safety, we have projects like the Colorado Avenue No Man's Land project that the planning study is just starting for this month. This would actually provide the construction funds to do Colorado Avenue through No Man's Land and Manitou. We have 4 more bridges on the safety issue that were really safety projects and not preservation projects. And then we have projects on roadways like the widening of Barnes just to the west of Powers, where there is no left turn lane for Barnes, but yet there are left turning vehicles, and they do it in the through lanes, creating a safety problem. Under expansion and enhancement, I told you we were looking for trying to fill in some of those links. One of the big links is the Centennial extension from Fillmore down to the Fontenarrow interchange. We also have the extension of Tut north of Dublin that is missing for just a very small segment, but interrupts our system and creates capacity problems in that area. And then we have interchange actually ideas such as I-25 Nevada and Tejon, where we wouldn't be changing the interchange itself, but we would be changing the striping and the way those 2 intersections work to make them work more effectively. Non-motorized, we have on-street bike lanes, we have sidewalks, and we have trail improvements in that subject. And in transit, the capital projects that we're really emphasizing in transit are the replacement of all of our buses. We have to replace buses on a regular basis, and in order to keep up with FTA regulations, all of the buses are going to need to be replaced in the next 12 years. So this will give us the 20% local match to replace those buses and to also right-size those buses when we do it, while we're looking at the process. That's basically what I've got today, excuse me, for information. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Kathleen, is it still the intent that the PPRTA 2 would still be a pay-as-you-go? In other words, we wouldn't bond?
No, we will not bond. It will be pay-as-you-go.
And then I remember a few years ago when we had problems with the Cimarron Bridge, and we were kind of scrambling to come up with the money, and we did. But the question it's almost a question of you give a list to the voters so you can say to the voters, here's what I'm going to do, but does it give us any flexibility? I understand what you talked about with the contingency, but say we had a major bridge failure sometime during that time and it wasn't on our list, it caught everybody by surprise. Does it give us any flexibility to address things 5, 6, 7 years down the road that maybe nobody thought about?
That will be something that we will need to address in the ballot language, and it's certainly something that we've been talking about. We have tried to address it with an emergency fund. We do have a much more careful analysis of our bridges now than we did in 2004. Our bridge department's done an excellent job of that, but you still do get caught by surprise sometimes, and so it would be really nice to do that. One of the things that we're going to recommend to the PPRTA board is a policy that says that if a local jurisdiction gets funding for an A project from someplace else, let's say I pull one of those federal grants out of the sky to fund No Man's Land, that the city would be able to replace that on the A list with one of our B list projects so that we could move something up. And that might be a way that can keep us sort of current and active, because sometimes we do get funding from other sources, and if we do, I think it's only right that we can be able to put something on the B list, on the A list, and take care of it immediately.
Thanks. Lisa?
Kathleen, you're so good. You answered all of my questions I had been writing down. I just wanted to reiterate what you said. You said it's about an estimated $27 million in annual cost that would be figured out that would have to come out of the general fund if PPRTA 2 was not approved.
The unfortunate thing is that I think we all realize that we probably couldn't come up with $27 million out of the general fund. And so what it would mean is that the city would fall $27 million behind each year in keeping up with our infrastructure needs in the city. And keeping up with our infrastructure needs really is the basis for having a pleasant place to live.
And it went in front of CTAB and was passed unanimously. It was recommended. It's been a great success for our community. So my question is if when we get to the point for approval, how do we campaign for that? Is that something? Because I'd like to be able to have staff come and hit my neighborhood association meetings and make sure that we have a real strong campaign for this, so that the community knows that this is just
Kathleen,
a great thing.
Kathleen, let me help you here.
Let me carefully answer
Yes.
that and tell you I'm not
Once this is a ballot item, she can't talk.
Right.
And staff can't talk. And so you know who gets to go? So
As soon as the ballot is approved in August, the city staff will no longer be able to say a word about that. And my goal at the moment is not to worry about this passing the public election, because I'm not a campaigner, I'm just a simple civil engineer. My goal is to provide the best possible project list for PPRTA to work with. However, between now and the time that the ballot is approved, city staff is more than willing to make presentations on the project list as a good list of projects for the city to any group that might want to hear it.
And then once it is a ballot item, the only 10 people in the city who can talk once this is, in terms of advocating for its passage, are the 9 of us and the mayor.
Okay.
And so you will find that you will get invited to homeowners associations, Kiwanis clubs, all that kind of stuff, because you and us, we will have to be the advocates in that point.
But that's also true for all the elected officials who are members of PPRTA.
That is true.
So it's not just the city of Colorado Springs, but all the members of the PPRTA.
I should tell you that the city's been working very closely with county staff. We do have some joint city-county projects on this list that we both have agreed to bring to the top of the list. And what we're planning on taking to PPRTA is a combined city-county list. You're getting a list that shows you the priority of projects by the categories that we use. When it goes to PPAT board, it will be combined with the county, and it will simply be an alphabetized list of projects, which is how the first one was presented.
Angela?
And I just want to clarify, I think I'll get with Rob McDonald with the PPRTA too, because PPRTAs are a little bit different than normal ballot issues, and there could be some changing rules from my understanding that we may not be able to speak from the time we decide this is going on a ballot, whether we have ballot title or not. So we want to make sure we don't break any of those rules, and I'll get with Rob to ask to clarify that, to make sure it goes out to everybody, because it is a little different than typical government regulations. But Kathleen, I had a couple of questions. Again, you did a great job. I really appreciate it. You did all my answers. I could spend all this time weekend. You got most of them, so I appreciate it. One of the things, though, I do have a concern about is the Powers Boulevard extension, I-25 to State Highway 83. That's a B list. When is
Yes.
your estimate on that B list date happening?
Well, actually, I feel pretty confident. If we go with a 75%, 150%, I feel very confident that we'll get to the B list. And we should get to the B list probably in year 7, which is a good thing because we'll have quite a few years. Once we go to the B list, then it will be up to city staff to determine what project on the B list we fund, first, that type of thing. And what we have on Powers Boulevard is just a partial funding of the extension of Powers Boulevard. We can't even come close to funding the entire thing with just PPRTA funds. But we wanted to show a partial funding that could be used as a local match with some type of federal money. So that In the future, if the feds say, you know, we've got some money here that would work well for Powers, but we need to show local money, as they have been saying to us more and more recently, we want to be able to know that we've got some place that we can go to and look for some local money that would be a match for Powers.
What if that road comes through sooner than later and we just have this one part missing? What's the plan? Because putting it on a B list, you've put it off. And if we built it in 4 years and we still have to get off, and maybe it's now more important. I'm very concerned about that.
That's right. If development came through and started building Powers, one of the things we would do is, rather than looking at creating any dead ends, for example, I would rather have a 4-lane road with signalized intersections that went all the way through, rather than build a freeway section that stopped and left everyone at a dead end. So if any portion of money came through, we would always emphasize the idea that it provide connectivity, and then we take additional money and improve it as it goes along. But let's say development occurred and there was a need for a small amount of money. Hopefully that's where something like trying to establish the rule that if we get funding for something on the A list, we can move a B list project up to the A list.
Wouldn't it just be easier to put this on the A list because it's something that has more potential of happening than not, sooner than later?
Well, the reason not to put it on the A list is, unfortunately, the state and the feds are very unclear as to when money might be available for Powers. The one thing they seem clear about is that it might not be in 10 years. And I can't be sure or not whether development will be available in 10 years. If it never happened, we would be stuck. In other words, if I put it on the A list, I have to do it on the A list. And I don't want to have just a small portion of money for Powers that I have to spend that I can't combine with other money that makes more sense. So we put it on the B list to give ourselves a better chance of gathering up the other funds.
What if something happens before the ballot issue, let's say, and money rains down from heaven and it's going to happen? How hard is it to move it to the A list?
Then I think it would be just a question of the PPRTA board making that decision. Because ultimately, this is a decision of the PPRTA board.
Okay, thank you.
Bernie?
Just to be clear, we're talking about reauthorizing the 55%.
That's correct.
The mechanics are that each of the member governments has to approve a ballot issue for their citizens.
That's correct.
So if we, as a city council, put it on the ballot for our citizens to vote on, our citizens say no, short-sightedly, what happens to the 45%? Are we still in the pot for that?
Yes, we are. That is basically permanent money. And the voters would have to vote to suspend that money in order to take it away. What happens with the vote is that all of the jurisdictions in the PPRTA will be going forward with this vote in November at the direction of the PPRTA board. And it is a majority vote of the entire community, of which the city is the majority. But if it passes, if the city, the county, and the various smaller jurisdictions all together, if you add them all together and it passes with a majority, then it passes for everyone. So we're in it one for all and all for one for this one.
So it's not the individual. Like if Rama folks turn it down, they're not out of it. If there's enough vote overall to pass it.
Rama vote, I believe, they have 140 votes of the 600,000 or so votes that will be available for this region.
But this will not also allow non-PPRTA people to opt in at this point?
The only community that is looking at opting in is Calhan.
Right.
If that passes in their April election, then they will be a part of this vote in November. No other communities will be opting in because no one has come to the board and asked to opt in between now and November.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Mayor Jeffson?
Oh, you can go.
Thank you. Kathleen, to clarify on the term, the current term expires December 31st of 2014,
That's correct.
but PPRTA is bringing this to the ballot 2 years early.
For
Why
a
is
number
that?
of
Why is
reasons.
that?
For a number of reasons. But probably the most important is it gives us 2 years that we know that this is going forward, that we can then concentrate on getting some design work done getting ourselves really prepared so that as soon as the money starts coming in January of 2015, we can be off and running with yet another PPRTA project.
So that then a 10-year extension would run through the end of 2024,
That's
which
correct.
takes us through a presidential election.
There's a presidential election in 2024, so there's still the opportunity for PPRTA 3 to be voted on at a presidential election as well.
And I've been
If
approached by some of the PPRTA 2 supporters wanting my support for a 20-year term. Just whatever it's worth, I can't do that. I think a 10-year term is something the public will entertain, if you agree, if it goes through 2024. And is that a long enough planning horizon to complete projects?
You know, I have to be honest with you, as someone who's been looking at these projects, I'm not sure that I could legitimately tell you that I've got 20 years worth of projects that are the correct projects to do. I think 10 years, I mean, if you look at PPRTA 1, if we hit it fairly well on those 10 years with the A list and part of the B list, I think that's about as far as you can go
And
and
one more
really
question.
understand your projects.
I'm sorry, Kathleen.
That's okay.
One more question. Where would the improvement of Powers and Stewart fall in line compared to the extension of Powers?
Well, actually, we don't have Powers and Stewart on this because Powers and Stewart is on the long-range plan at PPACG for federal funding, and we're looking at the ability to fund the first phase of Powers and Stewart, which will be the expansion of Powers to 6 lanes in that area within the next several years. So we're already looking at how to fund that through our federal funding. Powers between Highway 83 and I-25 is not on the long-range plan of PPACG for funding within the public government at the moment. And that's why we have put this on PPRTA as a potential for gathering some funds that could be used as a local match.
And I'll just go back. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is exactly, I was going to talk about the 10-year. I think that's the absolute max we could even ask. And the reasoning of it's an official year, we're sort of hinking with it, doing it 2 years early to make it match. I'm sure we can do that in the past. It's always huge ones. So, you know, the support with 10 years would be the absolute max I could go for. So I agree with the staff on that point.
I'm not making social plans beyond 10 years. So.
I was just looking, I'll be 60 by the time that ends in 2024, so. Me too. Yeah.
I'm not saying.
Bernie? Would since the capital portion expires in 2014, will the ballot issue say starting in 2015 for 10 years? So we're not actually not approving an 8-year period. We're approving
a 10-year. It'll
starting
start
at
January 1st of 2015 and end December 31st of 2024.
Thank you. Val?
In going through the project list, maybe it's just me, but I couldn't identify any projects in the downtown area. Could you explain the process for not including any road projects in the downtown area?
Well, you know, we have a long master plan of lists that we sort of got down to the PPRTA list, and to be truthful, there were several downtown projects, but for the most part, we had other funding identified for them that tended to say we should go to that other funding and not to PPRTA. We do have one, well, I'm going to say 2. I'm going to say 3 downtown projects. It's just a little extension of downtown. We do have a study that is being funded that looks at the connection between I-25 and Platte. And can that connection be improved, made stronger? Platte is our major east-west connector in this part of the city, but yet when you're on I-25, you don't have a clue in the world how to get to Platte. So we're looking at how do we make that a direct connection? Do we improve signing? What do we do to help that connection? There's that study. We have the improvements of the interchanges on I-25 at South Nevada and South Tejon, which is the south downtown area. And we have a design contract to design new bridges for the railroad crossings of Nevada and Tejon. Those bridges are about 100 years old, and I'm thinking they're getting pretty old now, so They're very expensive bridges to do, but we need to get the design done so that we can start looking at how to come up with the funding. So those are really the three projects that we have in the downtown area. We do have other downtown projects, but we have other sources of funding that we're looking for.
Jim?
Nice presentation. Thank you very much for all your hard work. We've spoken about one of the issues I have, which is Centennial Extension. So I guess my question is, as you go through these processes, is there a way to reevaluate the need and the cost? And, when Centennial was first planned, I think it was because of Intel. That's no longer a viable option. And then, as you and I have discussed, maybe turning left at Van Buren. So I don't know how to, you prioritize, reprioritize those. That's question one. Let me throw a couple out so you can answer them all. And
Okay.
as I say, then I'll listen on the radio. And then with regard to Powers and Stewart, you've alluded to that there's federal money coming someday. And if we have changed circumstances, and again, I'll go back to Centennial Extension, where you have planned money for that purpose, can you transfer that over to an area where you might have a greater purpose that would produce greater economic benefit for the region? And then lastly, I would advocate for the no man's land. Again, if there's a way to take some of the budget you have allocated for some of these things. I live over on the west side. That's a high crime area, and nobody wants to lay claim to that. I'm notoriously known for driving quickly and avoiding some of what I consider to be rules. You're safe to drive quickly over there because we can't get police protection over there. We can't get lights turned on over there. That's a horrible indicator in one of our major tourist areas. So I wonder how we take some of these funds and transition them over to an area that's identified pretty broadly as an area that needs immediate attention.
Okay. Let me see if I can answer those. On Centennial, Centennial was put on our comprehensive plan in the 1980s, but we have re-examined Centennial for the last 2.5 years since I've been here as what is the need for that? Will this be useful? Two things have happened. It has continued to have a need for the west side of town and to help the interchange of Fillmore and I-25 to offset the traffic at that interchange. Two things have happened that I think simply increase the pressure to get Centennial through. One is the VA clinic going in at the top of the hill there at Fillmore and Centennial. And two, fingers crossed, will be a Tiger 4 grant to do a diverging diamond interchange at Fillmore in the near future using that Tiger grant money. The analysis for that DDI interchange that CDOT has done is dependent on Centennial being through and a slightly lower volume on Fillmore in order to make that much cheaper interchange design actually function. So I think Centennial still remains an important missing link in our system that we need to finish. I think once it's finished that you will find that you'll scratch your head and go, how did we live without it all these years? The reason why Centennial is very important on PPRTA is that we don't have other sources of funding for it. It does not have the environmental clearance that would be necessary to fund it using any form of federal or state funds. With Centennial, it's going to be funded with local funds, in our case, local funds / developer funds, or nothing at all. And so that's why it's on PPRTA too. Powers and Stewart, we do have a plan. We have a consultant on board hired by CDOT who's looking at that plan. They're still in the process, but currently what they're looking at is the immediate widening of Powers Boulevard, which brings the intersection of Airport and Powers up to level of service B and C, which the Air Force is very happy about. It currently is at E and F. And then a longer range plan, call it your 5 to 10 year plan, that would provide a southbound flyover ramp for this southbound to eastbound movement at Stewart, and take it out of the signalized intersection at Airport and Powers, and then a long-range plan, very long-range, to complete the rest of the interchange. This phasing has been discussed with the commander at Peterson Air Force Base. He's very comfortable with the phasing and is grateful to the city to look at this and find a way to start funding it immediately, which is exactly what we're trying to do.
And then just the last follow-on, did you guys,
No man's land.
pardon me?
I didn't tell you about no man's land.
Oh, okay.
No
Thanks.
man's land, we have the planning process, which will be done this year. The RFP, I believe, was announced in the newspapers this week. We hope to select a consultant in about a month's time and get them started immediately. And that's a joint project between El Paso County, the City of Colorado Springs, City of Manitou Springs, and CDOT. Once that planning is through, the local jurisdictions are looking at all types of funding for this project, including PPACG funds, but we have it listed for PPRTA because we want to make sure that if no other funding grant becomes available, that we've got a funding source for this. We do have the money listed in PPRTA. It is one of the joint jurisdiction projects. It is the only joint jurisdiction project that covers 3 communities, and my guess is it will be #1 on the list when money starts coming in 2015 if we haven't found another funding source yet.
Good, thank you. And just one follow-on, just with regard to evaluating different routes, and again, back to Centennial, and full disclosure, I live in the area and am impacted by it, as are many of my neighbors, so I want to make sure everybody knows that I'm less than arm's length from this question. But have you looked at the evaluation of going on Van Buren? And I'd like to have you respond to that so I can respond to several of my constituents.
Certainly. Van Buren is a collector street that's actually was built to local standards. It has people's driveways on it and that type of thing. And then Van Buren simply leads to Chestnut, which, again, we have classified as a collector in that location, but built as a local street with people's driveways on a very frequent and houses very close to the street. If traffic were increased on Van Buren and Chestnut, the houses along those streets would basically become uninhabitable because of the increase in traffic. And for that reason, the city has committed to the Mesa Springs neighborhood that they will not build just a portion of Centennial and open it up. We have to build all of Centennial before we open it up so that we don't funnel traffic through that Mesa Springs neighborhood. We have included in the cost estimate, and we increased it again within PPRTA, to make sure that we have money available to do the neighborhood things that are really necessary to make Centennial a nice street, a good street to drive on, but also a good street to live near. And for the neighbors in your area, Centennial will be quite a bit below current grade and be depressed, which will help a lot with any noise impacts, that type of thing.
Jim, anything else? Lisa?
I just wanted to mention something quickly, that no man's land area, I'll refer to it as NML. I went and spoke to the county commissioners when they were approving that grant, and they unanimously did as well. I've met in that area with businesses, the block captains, county commissioner, House Representative Pete Lee. We know that this area is a problem. It's been a problem for almost a decade, and it's going to be a while until we get it. I do want to mention, though, Tim, just because you said, we've gotten some great response from the staff. So police and our traffic engineering, I'm very appreciative, and I need you. So please know that some of the response that we're getting as far as trying to address, and again, this is a long-term problem, but just even with the short amount of resources that you have, that I know that you're now, making an effort in that area. Thank you very much. I know that the neighbors appreciate it. It also is to the county sheriff, who has been responding a little bit more. But I just wanted to point that out because I do recognize that, and the neighbors recognize that, and don't go anywhere. Thank you.
Well, and even though you may not want to be this example, but I think Colorado Avenue through no man's land gives us that example of what happens if you have crumbling infrastructure that you don't take care of. It can lead to all sorts of other problems, and that's why I think the restoration of our streets and bridges and signals all of our infrastructure is so important.
Lisa, anything else? Brandy?
Kathleen, thank you for your list and all of your hard work, and as a lowly civil engineer myself, I completely understand. You mentioned powers between 83 and the interstate. Does that funding for that B list take into effect the fact that there's a sunset on that right-of-way? That as far as I understand it, you have to start building powers within a certain amount of time, otherwise the right-of-way reverts back to the developer, is that correct?
Oh, I'm not going to let the right-of-way revert back. We've already taken care of that. We worked with CDOT to have a grading project on that section of Powers, which is going to be started in the very near future, as well as some right-of-way purchase that needs to be taken care of. And with those two things, we will require the right-of-way come to the city for all of Powers so that we don't have to worry about that right-of-way rescinding back to the developer in 2018.
That is good to hear, thank you.
No problem.
Jen?
Just one comment. I just wanted to mention that there will be opportunities for public input on these lists. And from here, it goes back to the Citizen Advisory Committee with the PPRTA. They will have a public meeting, and then the full list of all the communities will come to PPRTA, and there will also be another opportunity then for public input. And then it will come back to us, and there'll be opportunity for public input then. But I think it's really important, and I hope that people begin to notice some of these projects, and if people have input, that now's a good time for them to participate.
Yes. You reminded me, I want to mention that CTAB, which I said approved this list, has worked very hard on this project for the last 9 months. I believe they had 5 additional meetings, special meetings, besides their monthly meeting schedule, and most of those meetings ran a full 4 hours and only talked about this project, so they've worked very hard on this.
Anybody else? Kathleen, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Appreciate all
I'll
the
see you
help.
on the 28th.
I echo my colleagues' sentiments, and I appreciate all your work on
Okay,
this.
thank you.
And let's take a short break.